I'm
All right.
here, unit of power, Harry. I'm a what?
We'll work on ours. I haven't even thought about it, looked at it.
Yes.
All right. Thanks for that.
He's so far ahead of me, I don't worry about it.
Well,
No, I've had the paper for 2 weeks.
the
I never
last
did
section,
anything about
or
it.
is it gonna go back
This
over?
way. Oh, his is good. What she says, I don't know.
Do you have a question, Patrick?
They were concerned, Kayla, about the exam was going to cover, whether it's going to be comprehensive or.
Okay.
Is it just gonna cover the last section, like what we cover from now till the end, or are you gonna go back to the very beginning of everything?
Yeah, so what I was planning on doing was having questions from your old exams, especially questions that maybe people didn't do so well on the first time, so that you have the old exams, you have the keys, so you can kind of study through those. And then I'll have about probably 25% will be just the new material, because we're not going to really cover too much between now and the final, just a couple chapters. But I'm not going to make you go back through all of the material, but just kind of go back and look at those old exams as kind of a review.
Okay.
So about 75% from the old exams and 25% from the new material, roughly. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Yeah, but not like all the fine details of all the old material. Like I said, just kind of look at your old exams, kind of review like key things that I put on the old exams. So I'm not going to make you like review all the lecture notes.
Okay.
All right. Does anybody have any other questions before we get started? And I'll talk more about the exam as we get a little bit closer to it. If you have any more questions. So Keysville and Christiana, I have all of your tests graded, so your grades should already be in the grade book. So let me know if you can't see them. I'm going to email you your feedback and everything once everyone online has taken it, and I can post the key. That way you can see your feedback on that. But if you can't see your grade in the grade book or you have any questions beforehand, let me know. Anything else before we get started on today's lecture? Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started. Today's not too long. So today we'll start the section on animal health, welfare, and the environment. And like I said, we're not going to cover every single thing in this section. We're just going to kind of cover a few chapters between here and the exam, and then do some review for your final exam. But there are a couple of important things in these chapters that I'd like to hit on. So today specifically, we're going to talk about animal behavior and animal welfare and the environment. Also, sorry, my voice is kind of still a little quiet because I don't fully have my voice back yet. So I'll try to speak up as loud as I can, but it's still a little raspy. So just a little bit of introduction. So livestock and companion animals exhibit different complicated behaviors, and that can be related to the care of their offspring or response to external stresses, which we'll talk about more in detail. So they can exhibit physiological responses, so that's responses that are going on within their body, and then behavioral responses to external stresses. And then there's also been increased concern about the welfare of livestock and companion animals, which is a really big important topic, especially in livestock production, because concern about animal welfare can actually end up driving changes in the industry, which we'll talk about a little bit in this lecture. So temperature stress is a really big stressor. So extreme temperature, whether it be high or low, can cause a behavioral response in the animal. So like humans, livestock and companion animals will become stressed when the temperature is kind of out of the range that they're comfortable with. So adequate housing is really, really important to kind of make sure that you're dealing with the temperature stress and trying to alleviate that as much as possible. So some of the behavioral kind of things that animals can exhibit includes aggression. So there are two major types of aggression. So there's interspecies aggression and intraspecies aggression. So the words are kind of similar, so it might be easy to get kind of confused. So interspecies is behavior between different species. So that would be like if a predator is attacking its prey, or other anti-predatory behaviors. So if that animal is defending itself against another species, that would be interspecies. And then intra-species aggression is aggression that's directed towards other members of the same species. So that could be including territoriality, which we'll talk about, social hierarchy, and other aggressive behaviors that we'll go a little bit more into detail with. So there are different types of intraspecies aggression, so different reasons that animals in the same species may become aggressive towards one another. So one of those is territoriality. And so that's basically when an animal, frequently the male, will defend the territory against an intruder. So you might have seen this with some animals before, dogs especially, like Trigger likes to defend the apartment if anybody comes in. So it could be a male defending a single female in the case of a herd situation, or it could be a male defending a group of females. So it just kind of depends on which species that you're talking about and what the situation is there. So a couple reasons for this. So it could be that the male wants to ensure that his genes get passed on. If he's got a group of females or a single female that he's breeding with, obviously her offspring are going to carry his genes. And so this is something that animals will do to make sure their genes are carried on. So I know in lions, if another lion kind of comes into that pack, the dominant lion will kill that off. Or if a lion comes in, it will kill off that lion and all of the cubs of that lion, because it's kind of crazy how animals do these kinds of things, but it really ensures that their genetics are being passed on and not those of another male. So again, how this kind of shows itself can differ with species. Another reason that animals might be really territorial is to protect a good feed source, especially animals that are kind of in the wild, or livestock maybe even. Typically, cows don't get too aggressive towards each other, but it can happen with some different species, so different reasons. So another thing that can cause interspecies aggression, so between the same species, is the establishing of a social hierarchy. So that would also kind of be called a pecking order, which you've probably heard that term before. And so this was actually first kind of talked about in chickens. So that's probably why the term pecking order kind of came about. So this is important in species that are really social. So species that like to interact with other members of their same species, because not all species do that. But if you think about like cows, they're herd animals, they like to be around each other. And it can also happen with group housed livestock, because when you have a lot of animals in the same space, you're going to kind of maybe create a situation where they're going to need to establish some sort of hierarchy and who's dominant and who's not. And so they'll do this to maintain stability, and also to reduce the chance of injury to the group. So some ways that this hierarchy can be kind of displayed and maintained is by the dominant animal showing aggressive behavior, and then the subordinate animal will show submissive behavior. So if you're kind of watching a group of animals, it'll be pretty easy to tell early on which one is going to be the dominant animal and which ones are going to kind of be the submissive animal. So examples of the social hierarchy situation would be like a lead dog in a pack, like say a pack of wolves. In chickens, again, I talked about chickens is kind of where this was first noticed. So that can be a big deal in chickens as well. And then pigs at weaning. So we talked about a lot of the stresses that pigs are at when they have when they are weaned, you know, new environment and all of those things. But also they are sometimes split up from their litter mates, and so they're put into a pen 3000 situation with pigs that they haven't met before. And so what you often see oftentimes is that they'll kind of bite at each other. A lot of them will have marks all over their body because they've kind of fought it out to establish that sort of pecking order. So it's definitely something that does happen and something to be aware of. Another thing that we'll kind of talk about with animal welfare, but putting sows in group pens. Sometimes some sows can be more aggressive towards others. So if you have a larger sow versus a smaller one, that could end up doing some damage. So just things to think about if you have a production system. So other aggressive encounters that could happen that would be considered interspecies aggression would be when a member of the same species attacks or kills another, or a forced mating situation, which could also happen. So testosterone, which you should all be familiar with after the lecture on reproduction. So testosterone is the male hormone, right? That was a question on your test. So the presence of the male hormone testosterone has actually been linked to aggressive behaviors. So testosterone acting on the brain can actually affect the frequency of these aggressive behaviors. So this could also explain why castrated males are less aggressive typically. So there's also evidence that serotonin, which is just a neurotransmitter, so it sends signals throughout the body, and its precursor amino acids, so serotonin is formed from tryptophan, can also be involved in brain control of aggression. And so I don't know if this analogy kind of makes sense, but if you think about, people always say at Thanksgiving you eat a lot of turkey and you get tired. That's because of the tryptophan in the turkey. And tryptophan is going to go into the production of serotonin, which is going to kind of have sort of a calming effect. So it can kind of have a role in aggression, because if you have more serotonin, then maybe you're not going to be quite as aggressive, or the animal's not going to be as aggressive. So research has actually been done on livestock. My lab actually did a study with feeding pigs higher levels of tryptophan at weaning to see how they handled the stress situation. And it really did help. It calmed them down a lot. They didn't fight as much. So it's very interesting how just a small change in your management practice, or the diet in this case, can actually really affect things, other things that are going on. So we're going to talk about the examples of interspecies aggression and kind of narrow it down a little bit more by some species. We're not going to go into all of them, but just some good examples. So in chickens, roosters are naturally inclined to fight. So some of you have probably heard of cockfighting before. So that takes advantage of this inclination that they have to want to fight and show aggressive behavior. And so the principle of pin order, and like I said, pecking order, was first established in chickens. So that's where the dominant animal would show a higher frequency or occurrence of pecking other animals. And so that's kind of how that came about. They would literally peck the other animals, so pecking order kind of makes sense. And then some breeds are more prone to aggression, so genetics can play a factor. I know that with the dogs especially, there are kind of people that are on either side of the fence, whether it's like genetics and they avoid particular breeds, or whether it's environment. I'm a believer that it's a little bit of both. So there are genetics that can kind of predispose animals to aggression, and then obviously environment can play a big part in that. So that's just kind of my take on that. But so it's good to be aware of, like we talked about, the different breeds of cattle. Herefords are typically a little bit more calmer than like your Charolais. So genetics can be a big thing to consider as far as handling characteristics and aggressiveness of the animals that you want to deal with. So the reason that feather pecking in chickens is a big deal is because it can actually lead to the death of whatever chicken is being pecked on, and actually cannibalism, which is not something you really want to think about, but it can happen. And so it's really, really important to understand this, because sometimes a lot of people, you know, and animal welfare is a big deal, but sometimes people that don't really understand it are like, oh, well, why are animals housed a certain way, or things like that. And what you'll actually see when you get further in animal science is that most of those things are actually to protect the animals themselves and not to be cruel or anything like that. So feather pecking is a big deal. So in the poultry industry, in order to combat this, beak trimming is performed to kind of prevent this. So you can see the picture on the right of this bird that obviously you may not be able to tell from the picture because I should have put one for comparison, but normally the top part of their beak will extend out past the bottom part of their beak and kind of come to a sharp point. And so what they do is they'll just kind of snip off that end of the top part of the beak. And so you see like that's kind of a blunt end that won't do as much damage as a pointy beak would. And it doesn't affect how they eat or anything else that they have to do. So it's very humane. but that's why it's done. So if you ever come across anything like that in the industry, that's what it's done for. And pigs will actually, babies have really sharp needle teeth, and those will be clipped to protect the sow, but also to protect the other pigs because they're very, very sharp. And when they start trying to establish an order, you can have the pigs getting scraped up pretty badly. So lots of different things in different industries that people do to kind of control these behaviors. So another example would be dogs showing territoriality. So that would be like barking when a strange dog or person enters their territory. Trigger's famous for this. Y'all have heard him many times. And one thing that's different than what you might expect is that female dogs who have actually been spayed, so that they've had their ovaries and uterus removed, will actually be more territorial than other female dogs. And why that is, I don't really know the specific answer. The only thing I could think of is maybe it has something to do with once those are removed, you don't have, your hormone levels will be affected. Maybe that has something to do with it. But that's kind of interesting because that kind of goes against what you would typically think. There are also breed differences in the number of aggression problems in dogs, as well as anxieties and phobias. So if you've had a lot of dogs or different breeds, you may have noticed that you may have had a dog that gets stressed out more than another, and that could be partly due to the genetics or the breed of that dog, and aggression problems as well. But again, I say some of it's genetics, but some of it also is environment. But just to be aware that genetics does play a part, and be aware of that if you are getting a breed that might be a little bit more prone to aggressive behaviors, and just know how to kind of handle that and nurture that animal. So like I said, these can be influenced by environment. And so that can go in a good way, or it can also go in a bad way. So like, for example, my dog is actually part German Shepherd, and he was abused at the rescue center before I got him, and he has major aggression issues that I have to deal with a lot. And so had he been abused, I think he still would have had issues, but that German Shepherd in there definitely didn't help matters. So he's kind of a good example of genetics meeting a crappy environment, and he's got issues that he's going to deal with for the rest of his life, and as long as I own him. So just a good thing to keep in mind if you have companion animals or thinking about getting a dog, you have small kids and things like that. So reproductive behavior is also an important type of animal behavior. So again, like we mentioned earlier, males want to increase their chances of passing their genes on to as many offspring as possible. Again, I would say that's probably more a situation that you would run into more in like wild species like lions, because typically if you have like a cattle farm, you're not really going to have more than one bull unless you have them very, very far away from each other, because that's just kind of asking for trouble, depending on the size of the operation. So that may not be an issue that you'll run into, especially in a lot of livestock production. You're using AI anyway, so you may not run into this reproductive behavior kind of aggressive thing. So this will actually increase the chance that the female gametes will be fertilized if animals are displaying reproductive behavior. And it also restricts mating within the species. So not all reproductive behavior is aggressive. Sometimes males can be a little bit aggressive, like when they're trying to make sure their genes are passed on if there's another male. But reproductive behavior can also just be the behaviors that animals kind of do prior to reproducing. So like birds in the wild will do kind of like a mating dance, or they'll have like a mating song. That's a reproductive behavior because their end goal is reproduction. So reproductive behavior can help the other animals identify when a female is fertile at estrus, and also help a producer identify when it's time to AI. Courtship behaviors prior to mating, like I said, birds are kind of a good example that come to mind for me, because at my companion animal class, we had to watch YouTube videos of birds doing weird dances to try to attract their mate. So I always think of birds when I think of this kind of courtship behavior. And then more in the livestock side of things, you'll have mounting, intermission, and then insemination. And then you might have parental behaviors to be able to feed and protect their offspring. So anyone that has a cattle farm and has ever tried to get close to a newborn calf might have run into some trouble there, especially with Charolais. So they will display kind of intense behavior, and an animal that may not normally be aggressive may become aggressive in a situation where it's trying to protect its young. So that's also something to consider too. Just because it's your favorite cow and she's never charged at you before, it's a whole different story when that cow has a calf. And also with other animals too. So just something to be aware of. So other animal behaviors include breeding behavior. So that's kind of one that's a little bit popular. I kind of think of monkeys. Monkeys will kind of groom each other and pick bugs off of each other. And if you've ever seen any of those Animal Planet shows, like I like to watch for some reason. Feeding, drinking, and elimination behaviors can also be some other behaviors that animals might exhibit. So some species of animals have specific behaviors related to urination and defecation. So for example, dogs will mark their territory by urination. So they like walk by a tree and they smell that another dog's been there, they're going to pee on that tree, or in Trigger's case, the 20 trees between here and the dog park. So he owns all of that. But so another thing is that pigs may defecate in specific areas of their housing. And I will definitely say that that is true. I think my pigs did it on purpose, but I had quite a few research pigs that insisted on pooping in their feeder. So I had to clean that every day, which was lovely. I really enjoyed it. And then I also had a couple that would just poop into the hallway, not even in their pen. So I had to clean that up too. And once they decide that's where they're going to go, they stick with it. They're committed. So that is definitely something I've seen to be true in pigs. They like their certain spot. So animals
Not very
also
trainable either.
Oh, no. Once they pick that spot, it's over. I just got so mad because it was in their feeder all the time. I had like 3 of them, and every single day I had to clean it out and give them new feed. And when you're trying to do a nutrition study, that's really annoying. But yeah, so behaviors to facilitate temperature homeostasis or thermoregulation, that's something that animals will do. And that's something that as a person, you would probably do too. So in order to promote cooling, if an animal's getting too hot, they will start panting. You've probably seen dogs panting when it's hot outside. They'll move away from the heat. So they'll try to get access to shade. So you'll sometimes see like cattle will start, trying to go up under the trees, or if you have a shelter in place. And then pigs will actually wallow in mud. Pigs have a few sweat glands, but they're not very efficient at sweating. So pigs are very susceptible to heat stress. So that's why you kind of typically think of pigs rolling around in the mud, and that's because they're actually trying to cool themselves off. So the opposite, to promote warming, if they're in an environment that's too cold, they will move towards the heat source, obvious. And then group animals will kind of start congregating together to share body heat and to make their body profile more compact to reduce the heat loss. So if you've ever seen animals kind of standing in a group and when in the winter, that's probably what they're doing. So lots of different behaviors that animals have. So communication is another big one. So there's auditory detection or hearing of vocalization. So animals can actually respond to each other's mating calls. So that's really important because if an animal is ready to mate, that needs to be made known to the rest of the group or her specific mate, whichever the case may be. Olfactory detection, so smelling of pheromones. So we talked about pheromones in a previous lecture. Pheromones can kind of attract members of the other species, or they can be used to mark territory. So again, marking territory, like I just said, so the response of bulls to urine of a cow in heat. They can actually tell from the pheromones that are being produced by the cow at that time that she is in fact in heat and ready to breed. And a good one with marking territory also that I always think of is cats. Cats can kind of spray if they want to, typically for more outdoors. But even in the house, if you have a cat that rubs up against furniture or rubs up against you, they're actually marking their territory because they kind of have glands that will kind of put their scent on different things. And when cats kind of knead on things too, like knead on a blanket, that's what they're doing. They're kind of putting their scent all over everything, saying this is mine, and every cat needs to know it. So there's visual detection of signaling movements. So in dogs, that could be submissive position. Like if you have two dogs that are playing and one of them kind of keeps rolling over on its back, that's a submissive gesture saying like, okay, I know you're bigger, so I'm going to go ahead and submit to you. Head movements like head moving and poultry, that could be something that they do to kind of communicate with each other. And then various tactile interactions, so kind of touching. That's particularly between the offspring and the parent. So parents may kind of nudge or touch their offspring to maybe move them out of a situation or to even kind of teach them how to do certain things. And it also kind of helps establish that bond between the offspring and the parent. So stress is something that's a big factor in a lot of different things. We've talked about it in different lectures before, how it can affect nutritional requirements and things like that. So multiple physiological and behavioral responses happen in response to physical and physiological stress. So you may have things that are happening in the body in response to that stress, and you may also have changes in the behavior that you can see outwardly in response to that stress. So the classic response, which would be a response in the body, so a physiological response, is a large increase in the release of cortisol, which was actually, I can't say that. So we talked about that in a previous lecture. So cortisol will be released from the adrenal cortex, and cortisol actually acts to protect the animal by increasing the availability of glucose for metabolism, and it also suppresses the immune system. So cortisol has many different effects on the body when an animal is stressed. So let's talk about two different types of stress. So there's physical stress and physiological stress, or physiologic stress. So physical stress would be like extremes in temperature, like we just talked about. And also it could be abnormally low concentrations of glucose, which is the most important sugar that's used by the body. So that could cause problems. And then a physiologic stress, or what could cause a physiological reaction, would be things like transportation, a new environment being handled in any way, dehorning in cattle, tail docking in sheep, and castration are just a few of those examples. So how do we assess whether an animal is stressed? So there are many different ways that you can do that. So there are behavioral indices. So you can kind of tell if it's to the point where an animal is actually being vocal or being aggressive. Obviously, that's pretty apparent that that animal is stressed out in some way. If you want to be a little bit more scientific, you can look at plasma concentrations of the adrenal stress hormone cortisol in mammals, and then it's corticosterone in birds. Those are the same thing. They're just different, called different things in the different species, but they're pretty much the same stress hormone. So you could look at levels of that. You could also look at production metrics. So this would kind of be more of a long-term way of assessing stress. But you could look at things like growth or milk production in dairy cattle. Egg production in laying hens is a good way. So again, that would kind of be something that would be a little bit more long-term that you would monitor over at least probably a couple weeks or so. There are other health indices, including the frequency of injuries, the frequency of disease, because when an animal is stressed, it's kind of using more energy to kind of deal with that stress. And again, it's suppressing the immune system because cortisol kind of suppresses the immune system, like we just said. And so if an animal is getting sick a lot, it could be that that animal is more stressed out than some of the other animals, which is making it more prone to disease. Also mortality, and that's because, like I said, stress will impair the immune response. So it's a good thing to kind of think about. Just because you're having a lot of animals pop up with disease all of a sudden, it could be due to the fact that maybe you're doing something new that's stressing them out. So it's always good to kind of come at a situation from a lot of different angles and think about everything that could be kind of creating that situation. So stress responses, we're just going to talk a little bit about livestock, horses, and dogs. So in livestock, like I said, painful procedures such as dehorning or branding can result of an increase in the release of cortisol, and that will actually cause an increase in heart rate. And so you may see behavioral responses such as kicking and vocalization. Anyone that's been around cattle has probably seen this. That says kind of livestock in general, but it just kind of depends on the species. Like sheep aren't really going to kick that much. They kind of just stomp because they don't really have anything else that they can do to you. So they just try to look like they're going to run you over and they just stomp at you. That I think is kind of funny. Horses, when the horses are stressed, the level of cortisol will rise. And so a way that you can kind of monitor this, and people that have done studies on horses will actually put either a young horse or a middle-aged horse on a treadmill for an exercise test. And they found that cortisol actually stays pretty high. Cortisol levels will stay pretty high for at least an hour. Dogs will have an increase in the release of cortisol, and interaction with people can actually reduce the stress response. I'd say that kind of depends on the interaction with the person. Like maybe an interaction with me would reduce stress for trigger, but interaction with a stranger would probably really elevate his stress level. So it kind of just depends on the situation. There are also behavioral indicators such as auto grooming. So cats will kind of like groom themselves way more than normal if they're stressed. Sounds like I've had animals with a lot of problems, but I had a cat who was a compulsive cleaner because it turned out that the cat was kind of getting stressed out by being around dogs, and so it was just cleaning itself until it like had no fur left. So that's a good example of a behavior in response to stress. Paw lifting can be another one, and then vocalization or barking is a pretty obvious one in dogs that something's going on that they don't really like. So temperament can really play a role in the behaviors of different species of different animals. So temperament can be evaluated in domestic animals. There are some things, like I said, like we know, like Herefords are typically more calm than, say, Charolais, and with other species as well. You kind of know a little bit which breeds are going to be a little bit easier to handle and things like that. But even within a certain breed that's prone to that, you're going to have some animals that get stressed out a little bit easier than others. So if you want to kind of evaluate that on an individual level, one way to do that in cattle is to evaluate them in a chute situation. So as they come through the chute, you can give them a score of quiet and calm, or the opposite, which would just be like wild and crazy. And it kind of seems like the wild and crazy ones are always the ones towards the back for me. I don't know. In school, we had to practice giving shots, and everyone else got to give shots to the calm animals, and I had the one who was like the hardest for them to get up there, and she got in the head gate and was just like jumping up and down, like her head was like stuck, but she was like kicking her whole back body, like laid down, and it was terrible, and I still had to give her the shot if I wanted the points, so it was very, very good. So another thing that's really important if you have a livestock operation or you're ever going to be part of one is to note that when research was done on this, cattle that scored as calm actually grew faster than cattle that were more agitated. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about the fact that when animals are stressed, they're going to be putting energy towards dealing with that stress. And you have energy taken away from the immune system and growth. And so it makes sense that they would grow faster. And also, cortisol is produced when animals are stressed, like we said, and that actually has growth impairing effects. And so animals that are calmer would have lower levels of cortisol, and so they would grow a lot faster. So it's really important to think about, and if you are going to be handling livestock, it's really important to take the extra time to maybe handle the animals slightly differently, like in a different way or in a more calm situation, because it really will pay off for the rest of your production, because those animals will probably grow faster than their stressed out counterparts. So something to be aware of. So animal welfare is a really, really big topic. It's something that as an animal scientist, I deal with a lot, and you'd be surprised how many interactions I have had with people that are not animal scientists that are have their own opinions about how things are done and may not necessarily know why. So if you are going to kind of stay in animal science, it's good to be aware of animal welfare issues and why things are done the way they're done. For example, like why beaks are trimmed in poultry. At Tech during my undergrad, we actually had a whole class for an entire semester just on these issues with animal science and how to deal with approaching people that don't come from that background, that don't really understand why, and how to explain to them that we do want the best for the animal, and kind of how to handle animal welfare issues. So producers are increasingly holding themselves accountable to consumers, because obviously if your consumers don't want to buy your product, you have a big problem and you're not going to be very successful. So this will actually really drive a lot of decisions that are made in production. So like we talked about previously in a lecture with the passing of the veterinary feed directive. And so part of that was due to the development of antibiotic resistance, which is a big deal. But another part of that is that consumers have kind of, been aware of the use of antibiotics in livestock production. People kind of freaked out about it and thought that antibiotics were in their meat, and they weren't. There's withdrawal periods. But because of all of that, and then, if one producer decides to start selling a quote organic or antibiotic free and labels it that way, then suddenly that producer is going to be kind of targeting those people and targeting the consumer that has concerns, and others are going to have to follow suit if they want to remain competitive. So I was actually at Smithfield Hog Production, and they were talking about how they had to go that way because they were going to start losing out compared to other companies that were doing that, because that's what the consumers want. So even though it may not always be the most efficient or necessarily the best thing for production, changes will have to be made based on consumer opinion and what consumers want and what they deem is acceptable. So that's kind of where. Yes.
Can I give you an example?
Yeah, go ahead. That'd be great.
Yesterday in a local grocery ad, they had fresh turkeys of a single brand that were $1.29 a pound. And the picture right next to it, it had another turkey, same size, antibiotic free, for $1.69 a pound.
Yep. Exactly.
And from your instruction and so forth, there shouldn't be a dime's difference in the two turkeys.
No, there shouldn't be. And honestly, like the thing that people don't seem to understand is even when antibiotics were being used, there's a withdrawal period on every drug. So they know when that drug will be out of the system. So it'll say on the bottle, stop administering 60 days prior to slaughter or 30 days prior to slaughter. So antibiotics were never in the meat, but people don't seem to understand that. But now with the veterinary feed directive, what I think is really funny is that was passed in January of this year. And a lot of consumers don't even know about that probably. So all meat is now seriously antibiotic free. But you still have people that are throwing it on a label and they're charging you an extra 20 cents for it. And people will pay that extra 20 cents, like you said, per pound, just because it says antibiotic free and they don't actually understand the system.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's a very good point. It's definitely a good thing to be aware of. I always, whenever I'm in the grocery store and I'm like looking at stuff, I kind of am one of those people that says stuff out loud, like jokingly, like, oh, look, it's antibiotic free, even though they never had antibiotics to begin with. Like, because I'm just trying to like educate the public in the freezer section or wherever I'm at, like just that weirdo, like talking to myself. But yeah, I mean, it's a big thing. So it's really important, and that's something that I really like to touch on in the animal science class, because you will encounter that, and once you know all of the actual science behind it, you can be one of those people that saves your 20 cents per pound. So in order to ensure that animal welfare it's dealt with. There's a third-party welfare assurance system that's kind of been developed. So they'll actually audit production facilities to ensure animal welfare. And this is a really good thing because you are going to have people that are not going to treat animals the way that they should. I know I saw recently someone in Charlotte County got busted that was working for Tyson. And so these welfare assurances are in place to make sure that animals are being taken care of and treated the way that they should be treated. But the way that I also kind of explain it to people is if a producer wants to make a profit, they're not going to be harming those animals because those animals are their livelihood and they're going to take care of those animals as best they can. So for people that try to paint farmers as cruel or inhumane, that's kind of one of my selling points is if a farmer's mean to his animals, he's not making any money. So what's his incentive to do that? So these third-party assurance, this system kind of helps combat that. So the focus on animal welfare typically follows campaigns by activist groups like PETA and standards enunciated by major users of animal products. So one big thing I will say on this is that the animal industry, I feel like, is not as active about educating the public as I think they could be. So I actually have friends that are choosing to be vegetarian for these kinds of reasons that will actually contact me and ask from my point of view because the only thing they come across online are articles from PETA or articles from animal rights groups that have taken a simple act like castration and put a video up and just made it look like the worst thing in the world. And so there's really, I will say honestly, if you're just doing a general search and trying to kind of learn about this, there is more information that you will find out there from these kind of anti-animal production groups than you will actually find the true information that you need to look for. So just make sure that if you are doing any research in it, in that area, that you're looking at reputable websites like where you're going to get good information like the USDA or Pork Checkoff or any of these like pork quality assurance. There's some for every different livestock species. So always look at your source. So that's important to know. And then, like I said, consumers need to be aware of the source is just a big, I put that bullet point there because I've had people come up to me and just defend their position. Like they're not going to budge on it. And I'm like, well, where'd you read that? And then they like told me the website. I actually went to the website and the website had a URL that made it look like it was an official website. And when you actually went to it, it redirected you to another page to an animal rights group. So they had actually kind of spoofed the website address that they were using to back up their facts to look legitimate. But then when you go to the site, it's like by PETA. So people really go to extreme lengths to try to influence animal production and paint it in a bad light. Hopefully those people don't ever want to eat meat because they're going to run into some problems there. But so these are just really big things with animal welfare that I always try to make sure people are aware of, especially if you are going to kind of continue in animal science. And it's good to be aware of because I saved you money at the grocery store because now you know the difference.
All right, 20 cents a pound adds up.
It's 40.
Yeah, right. Especially when you're buying like a giant Thanksgiving turkey.
Right.
That's the same thing why the turkey breast itself is more when you're taking part of the turkey away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but there's a big story with that one, but that's.
Yeah, part of that's going to be the value added that we talk about in a marketing class. If people just want the breast, they don't have to be dealing with the bones and the carcass and all that kind of stuff. So there is an argument for that.
Yeah, that's true. And like, I mean, especially with anything poultry, because you have like chicken nuggets, chicken tenders that are pre-breaded, all these things. So like, yeah, like Tom said, you may end up paying a little bit more for a product that's been further processed because it's saving you the trouble of having to like, take the whole in yourself or deal with the intestines and things like that. So temperature control or thermoregulation is a really big thing. We've hit on it a little bit in the lecture already. So domestic animals like livestock, poultry, as well as companion animals are homeotherms. So that means that they will maintain their core body temperature within narrow ranges that they're kind of comfortable in. And typically those ranges are a little bit above what their external environment may be, depending on the situation. So metabolism, activity, and digestion are all things that can produce heat. So actually just by eating and digesting food and things like that, that will actually produce heat within the body, because these processes within the body use energy, and some energy is going to be put off as heat. So different ways that animals can kind of control their temperature. So domestic animals are homeotherms, like I said, but they can also be turned endotherms as well, and that's because they generate heat. So the endotherm term kind of just means that they can generate their own heat. So if you think about that in comparison to like a reptile or something that's always trying to get in the sun to kind of get heat from the sun, they're not an endotherm. They would be an ectotherm. So just differences in the way that animals maintain their temperature. So in a steady state situation, heat would be produced by the body, and that's also going to be balanced by heat that's going to be lost to the environment, because even though heat's being produced in the body, it's not just going to like continue to be produced until that animal spontaneously combusts. It's got to go somewhere. So it is, some of it's lost in the environment. So at temperatures above the thermoneutral zone, and the thermoneutral zone basically just means that temperature range that that animal's body is comfortable in. At temperatures above that zone, heat can be lost by increasing their evaporative heat loss, increasing blood flow to the skin, and behavioral responses such as wallowing in ponds or in mud. At temperatures below the thermoneutral zone, mammals or birds will respond by increasing the production of heat. And so they can do this with increased metabolism. And then there's also shivering, that is actually a response to try to get your body to move to kind of produce some activity and produce some heat there. And then there's also non-shivering production of heat. So ways that the loss of heat can be reduced is through vasoconstriction in the skin and extremities, increased insulation by laying down a layer of fat, because fat is pretty poorly conductive of heat, so it won't really necessarily go through that fat. It'll kind of, the fat will kind of keep that heat in. So if you think about animals that have to be in cold environments, I know like seals and animals like that have a good amount of fat because they're in cold water, in cold temperatures. So that can actually increase their growth prior to the winter. Animals may start putting on a little more fat, especially animals that hibernate. Behavioral responses such as increasing the insulation from the hair or feathers by kind of like ruffling or puffing up their feathers, that can kind of help keep some of that heat in. So heat sources and other responses to heat stress. So good sources of heat, obviously the number one source of heat, the sun. Litter or bedding can help. That can kind of help if you have a situation where they're going to be housed on like a cold concrete floor. If you put some litter or bedding down, especially for like baby animals, that'll really help. Other animals, if you can have a situation where you can have animals in a group when it's cold outside or in a building, that's always good. Lights, you could use like heat lamps, and just lights in general will generate a little bit of heat. I know for baby pigs, sometimes in the research studies, we have to bring in heat lamps, and sometimes in the farrowing barns, they'll have heat lamps to kind of keep those baby pigs warm. Mechanical heat from automated feeders and things like that. And so then responses to heat stress would be for the animal to reduce virtually all of their activity. Panting in dogs and poultry, birds will pant as well. Sweating, which is kind of a common thing that's seen in horses. When you take off their saddle and everything, you probably see that they've sweated a lot. Licking surfaces, cats will do that. And then again, wallowing in mud, which we talked about with pigs, is a big way that they do that. So environmental problems of extremely low temperatures and things to consider. Extremely low temperatures can lead to reduced performance in livestock. Like we said, anytime they're going to be using energy for other things, so like energy to generate heat, they're kind of taking energy away from growth, so you're going to have reduced performance. You could have a frostbite situation if it's cold enough, hypothermia, and even death. I know sometimes, like especially with calves that are born outside, if for some reason you have a situation where you have a calf that's born in like the dead of winter, you're going to want to get that calf inside. Also, another thing to consider is, especially with animals outside in the winter, their water supply may freeze. So you want to be checking that pretty regularly to make sure that it's not just a block of ice, and make sure that they do have access to water. Wind chill can result in frostbite and waste loss of dietary energy for maintenance of body temperature. So you're going to have losses there because that animal is going to be using that energy to generate heat. And so a good way to kind of combat this is by having windbreaks or shelters. So whether that just be kind of like a 3-sided, shelter that the animals can kind of go into, or just something to kind of break up wind that may be coming across the pasture in the winter. Trees will even kind of break that up if you have enough of them. So they can prevent problems of low temperature. So things to consider. It can be a problem, but I mean, obviously it also depends on the area that you're in. If you have animals a little bit further up north, you're going to have more of a problem with this than we typically do in the south. But it can be a problem, especially, like I said, for newborn animals that are born outside. So lots of different things to think about. Does anybody have any questions on what I covered? All good? Okay. Well, let me know if you can't see your grades. And like I said, once everybody online has taken their exam, then I will post the key and I will be emailing each of you your individual feedback about the questions that you missed or whatever. All right. Have a good weekend.
You too. See you Tuesday.
Okay, bye. Okay, you too. Try to get the test done, Tyler.